Friend Alma Hobart, having freely and sincerely accepted the builder's plan, thou hast labored diligently towards the inevitable realization of his perfect will through thy thought, word, and deed. Thy heart and mind are constant and true. Ye have rejected the darkness of the trickster and his minions, and have vowed to destroy the unrighteous wheresoever they may be. Brother Ortham looked down on her with unconcealed condescension. From upon her knees, Alma looked straight up at him with unconcealed indifference. To remain ever faithful to the builder is the sacred duty of all souls, Ortham continued. However, the mantle of leadership requires more. One needs must possess. And on he went. Even though this was the happiest day of her life, Alma would cherish its memory all the more for not quite being able to recall Ortham's speech. Instead, Alma allowed herself to focus every fiber of her awareness on her surroundings and upon the feelings that followed. The pillow she knelt upon, red with an embroidered black Mechanist gear, had been used in the ordination ceremony of every priest and priestess of the new order so far. On the altar where Brother Ortham now stood, Father Karras had delivered his sermons, even when he and the brothers were still Hammerites, trying to reform that moribund sect. And it was here, in this very room, that the second new sanctum had been declared. She'd been present. Alma felt blessed, beyond her ability to put it into words. When she was a teenager, Father Karras had come to be their parish priest. Now, with Angel Watch complete and Sulforge Cathedral almost so, Father Karras would be leaving. Once he did, no one except the senior leadership of the order would have easy access to FaceTime with him. Eastport Church had been rededicated as the Eastport Seminary. Henceforth, its main purpose would be to take in novices and turn out elevated acolytes, priests, and priestesses. Alma cherished a profound sense of participation. She was a part of the most important turning point in the history of humanity. Speaking from the long position of experience, I declare to thee that Ortham was still going on at full cruising speed. She had not been able to avoid a touch of perilous pride. Her family was devout, and had always been involved in the church. When Father Karras had declared that women were to serve as fully active members of the order, she had thrown herself at it. It will not be easy, safe, or encouraging. The faithless will seek to gain entrance. It is thy duty not just to contemplate, but to act. Decisions are often burdens most heavy. They will weigh down mightily upon thee, and yea, the cause thee many a sleepless night. Friend Alma, please be warned that as a dutiful Mechanist clergywoman, the word stuck in his throat. Father Karras had ordained Friend Vilnia as the first priestess of the Mechanist order, and he'd declared that her ordination was not an exception. It was the new rule. Alma had been ecstatic, and she had a new dream. Nowhere else in the whole city could she ever have found anything comparable to aspire to. Very soon thereafter, Father Karras had elevated Friend Vilnia to his High Council. The High Council. Only the brothers, Karras's followers who had come with him from the Order of the Hammer, sat on the High Council. It was true, Friend Capeza had not been a hammer. Actually, he was very new to the order and not at all versed in religion. In fact, he was utterly indifferent to anything save his work. Many were suspicious of him and uncertain why Father Karras had decreed that he, too, would sit on the council. But Capeza was a man. It set ill with every one of the brothers having a woman on the High Council, but there was naught they could do. And, besides Father Karras, Only Brother Cavador would contradict Friend Vilnia right to her face. The other 6 council members were more cautious in their dealings with her. "Thou shalt be tested, and we are watching." Brother Ortham had noticed that her thoughts were elsewhere. "But more importantly, he is watching. He knoweth all that doth transpire in—" There were many women in the order now, novices and elevated acolytes, and they were not mere contemplative nuns. They served as friends at arms and workers alongside their male counterparts. In less than 5 years, Lord Caris had helped womankind to take their rightful place as the equals of man. The concept was not unknown outside of the order. The City Watch now had female officers, and many private contractors were beginning to follow suit. So many things were changing, and they were changing for the better. "I will now accept thy vow, acolyte." Ortham glared down at her and had not succeeded in keeping his tone neutral. Alma turned away from him, away from the altar, and away from the stained glass window. To her right, in the chapel throne, sat her spiritual master, her light, her guide, and her hope. Father Caris radiated calm, love, wisdom, and peace. Seeing her looking at him, his smile increased ever so slightly. "I will uphold the creed and the precepts of the Mechanist order. I will be a light and a guide to all those who would set out on the path that Father Caris hath chosen for us, the complete fulfillment of the Builder's perfect will. To the Builder I give my pledges of righteousness, obedience, chastity, and effort. I will give to the order my humble service and unwavering loyalty. May my strivings help lead us towards the Builder's ideals." She inhaled, paused. She hadn't intended to, but she could not help but rest for just one moment in this holiness. She held her gaze at Father Caris. He stared straight back at her with unaffected solemnity. He was totally present with her, and he was completely sincere. This was communion. Yes, their souls were hand in hand, but not for each other. They were joined in service to the Builder. Even though Father Caris was the master and she the student, in their devotion to the Builder they were equals, sharing in the most profound of human experiences. "This I swear, in life and even unto death." Silence. In her peripheral vision, Alma could see a gaping, reddened hole. It was an aghast Brother Ortham's mouth. She turned back and faced him with a cool gaze. "Now you may proceed, brother," she thought to herself. Brother Ortham twitched and looked over at Father Caris. The quiet smile from a moment ago was gone. Father Caris sat with a straight back and regarded Brother Ortham with a dissatisfied stare. The index finger of his right hand was visibly tapping the armrest of the throne with a slow but precise rhythm. Then be it known to the elect here assembled, and unto all true believers everywhere, that thou art Friend Alma Hobart, elevated priestess of the Mechanist order, and a holy pure woman. Please arise, and congratulations." The smile he made at her might have been cast in discolored drip seal. He hadn't even torn it off before turning from the altar. The audience cheered, and from the balconies above, the wax cylinder machine started up and the music began. The extra-large amplification cones made the sound seem like a large municipal choir. Alma got to her feet and handed the wand and the gear she'd been holding to the altar boys. She turned to face the audience, wondering why their cheering kept getting louder. She turned to her right, and there stood Father Caris. She almost fell over backwards. He gently reached out and took both of her hands in his. "I am so happy for you, child." His voice was all the more tender for its slight impediment. "Thank you, my lord." A hoarse whisper was all she could manage. I am mindful that thou hast been with us since the beginning. I do remember, he said. His smile seemed to get more and more joyful, yet he remained so calm. Reaching into his cloak, he pulled out a graceful golden-colored chain from which hung one of the 10 eternal gears. The interlocking rings of the chain could withstand hundreds of tons of pressure. The gear itself was even more fantastic. Its very existence nearly defied the laws of physics. The gear was composed of an outer layer of platinum several atoms thick, enough to give it a translucent golden sheen. Beneath this was a layer of perfection glass, as yet totally indestructible by any known method. The explosive force necessary was possible in principle, but not feasible in practice. The glass reflected the light in such a way that it seemed to be luminous even though it wasn't. It merely sent the incoming photons back out in a diffuse, uniform haze that contained no recognizable pattern. But it, too, was not opaque. Then there was the core of the gear. The molecules of the alloyed steel were arranged in a perfectly interlocking hexagonal pattern. Theoretically, there were imperfections, but the arithmetic of describing them was beyond human reckoning, and it would be generations before difference engines that could handle the numbers would be built. The size of her palm, the gear was a penultimate symbol of what the Order, nay, humanity, was capable of achieving. Only the builder's own tools were said to be more mysteriously crafted, and only Father Karras, Brother Cavador, and Friend Capeza ever got to see or handle them. Father Karras placed the gear in her hands and put a hand on her shoulder. "My lord," her whisper was just a faint exhale. "We are joyful today. The whole Order is joyful." Father Karras removed his hand. "Allow thyself a measure of satisfaction, but I ask you to remain ever vigilant. The Builder has chosen thee for a most important task, all in his time. Until then, allow us to direct thou to the work that will best prepare thee for the moment when it arrives." Yes, she tried to sound more composed. She'd had no idea that Father Karras would have time to congratulate her personally, that he'd be giving her a gift that in crude monetary reckoning could devalue whole currencies, or that the Builder, had selected her for a most important task. Father Karras had walked away. She noticed that despite his age and unassuming figure, he could move both quickly and very quietly. She watched as he exited through the door at the rear of the chapel, towards his workshops and quarters, with the typical assortment of committee members and guards following close behind. The audience had disintegrated too. The lay people were exiting through the front doors. They were a minority. Most of the laity who came to services either joined the Order or didn't return. The exception to this rule was the nobility, and she was not of high enough birth to warrant their presence today. The wisdom of Karras was not for the common man or woman. All were welcome to come hear the truth and join the Order. Those who were worthy forsook the mundane life. Those who were not worthy didn't. The Order's relationship with the nobility was different. Alma had not been born yesterday. It was obvious that Father Karras had used the closed nature of the Mechanist Order to offer the nobles yet another exclusive club to belong to. And the Order of the Hammer had always favored contrite and tithing commoners. The nobles had been expected to pray for humility and to donate generously. Now, the nobility donated freely to the Mechanist Order on their own terms. The particulars didn't matter. The money continued to flow. It had funded the research, paid the construction costs, and had pulled the political strings. Where would the Order be without the noble houses? It seemed cynical, Alma allowed, but it was the Builder's plan playing out. The nobility had hoarded the wealth, so now it was being put to proper use. Some among the nobility still clung to the old faith, and others couldn't care less either way. The division was becoming a source of tension in the life of the city, but the order had the backing of a solid majority of both first and second-tier houses, including all of the inner circle with the exception of the House of Rothschild. And now, she could not put off talking to her family any longer. She headed over to her parents and brother, who were waiting for her among the pews. Her mother, Margaret, was clearly not filled with joy. Her father, Josephic, looked nervous, as usual, and her brother, Jabrick, already wanted no part of the coming discussion. "We're so proud of you," Josephic threw the words out as quickly as he could. "Ye shall not visit us," her mother said woefully. "Mother," Alma began, "we hath had this conversation already. Aye, we are religious people, but life 'tis not only about the church, dearest," Margaret said. "Ye are a smart girl of acumen and industry. Didst ye not hear a word I've spoken to ye of Lady Van Vernon and Lady Rumford? Aye, in their manner ye couldst be the mistress of your own firm, or maybe just a shop. Like your father, we could help ye with the money," her mother continued. Already, she was almost pleading. Alma began. She still didn't know how to tell her mother that she had no interest in going into business. Several years of the same conversation over and over again. And she was yet to tell her mother a firm no. "I just want you to be making your own decisions, dear girl. Do not the scriptures command us to be honest to others and to ourselves, without exception? Are you sure that this is what you want?" Her mother had said it loud enough for other people to hear. It was her favorite tactic. "I am sure. My heart harbors no secret doubts, and if I were in any measure untrue, Father Karras wouldst know it. If my vows were not sincere, he wouldst not have accepted them. Or dost thou doubt the discernment of Lord Karras?" Alma addressed her mother as a priestess would address an erring acolyte. Margaret seemed to deflate in front of her, and it was almost heartbreaking. On today of all days, her mother's sermons extolling the virtues of a worldly life were an exercise in futility. Couldn't her mother see that? It seemed that Margaret's faith had begun to flag in her later years, replaced by a new liberalism that favored commerce and the creature comforts it promised. Alma wanted no part of it. The world was a corrupt, broken shadow of what the builder had originally envisaged. Much of the blame lay at the hoofed feet of the trickster, but also with the errant son, and most of humanity had sided with them. That was long ago, but the damage was yet to be undone. The church was Alma's life. It always had been, and it always would be. Even as a little girl, it had seemed obvious to her that the city was a seething maw of violence, perversion, and extravagance. Alma would not have her soul or her flesh become yet another unit of fuel in the belly of the unreasoning, all-consuming beast that was civilization. Her mother gestured defeatedly at Alma's attire. "Thou art a beautiful girl, sure. Not like anybody would know. I guess you're in there somewhere." "A priestess's vestments are modest by design, and I am not a girl. I am 40 years old." Alma noticed her tone hardening. "And I am making my own decisions." "This ends today," she said inwardly. Her father was frantically muttering at them, gently patting her mother on the back, trying to avoid a scene. "My daughter, the priest. 'Tis not as though we didn't let you spend all your time here anyway. What about my grandchildren?" Now her mother was just whining. "You have a son who will pass on his father's name," Alma said it matter-of-factly. "He is handsome, upright, and far more industrious than I." Alma directed her best teasing smile at him. Jabrick tried to look annoyed, but couldn't help smiling or turning slightly red. "Why dost thou not redirect thy energies to finding a suitable match for him?" Alma challenged her mother. "Ah!" To Alma's surprise, her mother turned to leave without another word. We're very happy for you, sweetie. Pray thee do come and visit us," Her father's smile was innocent, supportive, and greatly relieved. Da never could abide his loved ones arguing. "Thank you, Da. I will visit. I promise." Alma hugged her father. She did not remember a time when her Da was not kind to her. Then he too let go of her abruptly and took off after her mother. Alma felt a new sense of unease arising within her. Her brother Jabrick stepped closer, but did not embrace her. "Well, sis, you will be the headmistress of this place in no time, says I," he smiled. Alma rolled her eyes, but she also smiled back at him. She would miss her big booger. "May the hand of the builder receive you," Jabrick said. That was odd. Her brother was very religious in his way, but he was not one to offer blessings. All trace of the thick Old Quarter accent was suddenly gone from his voice. "May the hand of the builder receive us all," Alma replied. "Aye, he'll receive thee sure enough, and ye of the order proper are in his hands. 'Tis well. And for the rest of us on the streets of this city," he paused and looked straight at her, "we shall be as dust blown on the wind." And with that, he too turned and walked off. There was no question of following after him and asking just what in the maw of chaos he had meant. It had almost sounded blasphemous, but then prophecy often sounded so. To the Hammers, Lord Carys was a great blasphemer. In their delusion, they had tried to take his life several times already. Alma had no idea what to do with her family's melancholy farewells. It was as though they really did not expect to see her again. She wasn't going anywhere. The Mechanist order was not a cloistered tomb. A Mechanist's work lay in transforming the world, not in building walls to hide from it. She fully intended to regularly visit her parents and brother. Was Jabrick a prophet? Was what he'd said in some way connected to the task that the builder had apparently assigned to her? And if her brother was a prophet, why did he foresee his own doom? The scriptures were clear. The builder did not bestow prophetic vision upon the unworthy, and his wrath did not fall upon the faithful. Alma yanked herself out of her ponderous musings. The chapel had emptied out. There were friends busy at work on the balconies of the second floor, in meeting rooms at the bases of the bell towers, and the altar boys were resetting the altar. Below her feet, work would be resuming in the factory. By the reckoning of the decrepit Hammerites, the Eastport Church was still a relatively new building when the Mechanists had appropriated it. It had been laid out in the manner of the Hammer churches from the days of the Old Sanctum. Several of the presiding master forgers had found the anachronisms overly sentimental. The church's design and ornamentation seemed to recall the long-ago catastrophe in the Old Quarter. The walls separating the property from the rest of the city were castle height, with a heavily fortified sally port right across from the church's front facade. The smaller side entrances were strengthened by heavy-gauge iron fencing. As Hammerite tradition dictated, the graveyard for the resident brothers was located within the church walls. There were also several mausoleums containing the remains and relics of several minor saints. And there were the damnable crypts. Eastport Church had been built upon the site of a catacomb so ancient that when it had been built, the Eastport district was an undeveloped field. Alma shuddered, her eyes involuntarily locking themselves onto the heavy door on the northern side of the chapel. That door led down a flight of stairs to another, heavier door made of solid iron. Every measure had been taken to ensure that the iron door would never need to be opened. The problem was that the overproud Hammers had built the workshop underground, right against the sunken walls of the crypts. The Mechanists had had no other option but to extend the underground factory away from the crypts as best they could. The underground construction had been a long, dangerous project, and there had been an incident. Alma closed her eyes, and there were friends Stanton and Ludwig. "Behold, he has taken thee to serve with him for all eternity," Alma said inwardly. Alma left the chapel. The acolytes' quarters were laid out in the archaic pattern of two perfectly symmetrical rectangular barracks, divided by a hall leading back to the chapel. Each living area had two levels, the ground story for priests and priestesses, and a crammed lower level for the acolytes. Beyond the acolytes' quarters was the staircase leading down to the factory, and a door leading to the secure annex, where Father Karras and the High Council members lived and worked. Alma turned to the right and went up the stairs and through the door into the eastern acolytes' quarters. Friends Dierne and Lisel sat upon one of the four bunks which were designated for the priestesses. Alma sat down at the desk and opened the schedule. In just a few hours, she'd begin her first assignment as a factory supervisor for the overnight shift. She had a lot to go over. She needed to know who was supposed to be there, what their assigned duties were, how many crates were due before they paused for vigilance, and how many would be due before morning prayers. The men of the docks do palpably gaze at the garb of the acolytes, but even at us also. They rejoice, as they put it, to behold a woman in uniform, Friend Dierne said. "'Tis the truth. Preaching to the people in the taverns or on the streets, one encounters attention of all kinds. Would that they'd stop offering me the drink," Friend Lisel sighed wistfully. They were degenerates, both of them. It was an unfortunate but undeniable reality that not all who wore the garb of a Mechanist truly upheld their vows entirely. Friend Dierne was a former prostitute who had been incarcerated at Cragscleft Prison. When she emerged, she'd started attending services, talking all about how the Hammers had reformed her. The Hammers were at best clumsy and insensitive in their dealings with women. Often they were worse. Much worse. Friend Dierne had advanced quickly in the movement, making every possible use of her unlikely success story to grease the gears. Alma could not understand how Father Karras could have assented to her ordination as a priestess, but she did not like to question him. And Friend Dierne was unacceptably immodest when they were changing, and Alma had seen the scars on her back and the hideous brand on her thigh. Friend Dierne also had the curious habit of keeping her hair tonsured, even though she wore the same headscarf that the other priestesses did. Her impure thoughts and speech, as well as her odd behaviors, left Alma with an uneasy, void feeling. She felt sad for Dierne. No woman deserved what the Hammers had done to her. But that one so troubled could be a Mechanist of rank, it was cause for concern. Friend Lisel was a drunkard, and Alma suspected that the drink was not her only addiction. More than once, Alma had watched Lisel collapse onto her bunk, having barely managed to deliriously limp her way across the room. She, too, had run into trouble with the Hammerites, but unlike Dierne, Lisel had friends with money and influence. Lisel was neither reformed nor repentant of her vice. She merely concealed it well. It was true, both of them were better at proselytizing to the Gentiles than Alma was, but their preaching was hypocritical. Alma wondered what use they'd be put to now that the order was sitting back on its outreach initiatives. "Art thou well, friend?" Lisel asked. They had noticed her staring at them. "I shall be coming on watch at 11 bells, Alma said to break the silence. "Aye, friend, thy first time supervising a shift in the factory. Art thou ready?" Dierne gave Alma her sweetest smile. "I am," Alma said, deliberately sounding thoughtful, "though I ought to have a proper rest beforehand. But first, friend," Lisel said with some delicacy, "I think thou wilt wish to go and see Brother Theodoric and Friend Vilnia." "What?" Alma looked up. "Have they called for me?" "Nay, friend, but surely thou must understand that thy stunt during thy vows didst give some offense to the office of the High Council. Better to go and receive thy reprimand, feigning sincere regret, than to be humiliated in front of the acolytes by Brother Artus tonight." Alma suddenly felt like a novice. What had she done wrong? My stunt? I thought Fretus would be supervising upstairs tonight, Alma said. He will, while Brother Artus retrains him, Friend Yearney said it quietly. Friend Fretus was the problem child, more so than any of the acolytes, or, for that matter, any of the novices. He was the son of the rich donor whose money had paid for Markham's Isle. Fretus was nervous, abrasive, stubborn, and he lacked confidence. He was also dangerously clumsy. He could single-handedly cause a disaster with the lightest touch of his hand, and yet somehow he was already a priest of the Mechanist order. Brother Artus was the councilman in charge of managing the order's dealings with the city watch. Artus was older than Friend Capezza and had been a Hammerite for his entire life, but the two shared much in common. Both men had no use for religion. Both of them loved to build, and they loved to look down on almost everyone around them. Pairing Brother Artus with Friend Fretus was certain to cause headaches for the entire night shift. She was certain that she would see them coming down the stairs into the factory at some point in the night for whatever reason. Probably Artus would undertake to show Fretus how to weld properly. Well, Alma said as she stood up, won't it be a grand old time having a councilman dragging Fretus all over the place all night long? Somehow the sympathetic expression on her colleagues' faces did not seem fake. I suppose I should receive my retribution, Alma turned to leave. Friend Gretchen shall be supervising the security detail tonight. I will ask her to base her team out of the factory office just for good measure, Friend Yearney called after her. I thank thee greatly, friend, Alma replied over her shoulder. Alma felt bad. She did not have the highest opinion of either of them, and they were trying to help her. Leaving the living quarters, Alma rushed hurriedly down the stairs, turned to the left, and crossed the hall over to the armored door which led into the secure, fortified annex. Alma banged on the door the specified number of times. A viewport slid open beyond which two unblinking eyes surveyed both Alma and the hallway for anything untoward. Satisfied, the acolyte slid the viewport shut, unbolted, and then opened the massive iron door. It groaned loudly on its hinges. Alma rushed through, and the acolyte slammed it shut behind her. It was Friend Loris, utterly humorless and unthinkingly loyal. He was one of only a few acolytes allowed to guard the annex, a job which fell primarily to the builder's children. Now Loris was directively pointing down the corridor which ran along the annex's outer shell. Alma got moving. The outer shell of the annex was a cube, formed by interlocking armored plates. Inside of this was a smaller cube-shaped building, where Karis and the High Council members maintained offices and modest cells. Reaching the northwestern corner of the building, Alma turned to the left and went down the next corridor. Along the inner wall were the doors of the council members' offices. All were closed with the lights off. That meant that they must be in a meeting with Father Karis, and Alma was certainly not going to venture that far. She almost entertained the hope that this was all for naught when she reached the common area at the southwestern corner of the edifice. Friend Vilnia and Brother Theodoric were seated at the conference table, clearly going over something major. They looked up, noticing her. Alma stepped towards them, bowed her head as protocol dictated, and took another 2 steps forward. There was a pause, and Alma knew she was in for it. And behold, Brother Theodoric gestured, the younger generation. Alma knew to remain silent. Perhaps, Friend Vilnia remarked with apparent skepticism. This younger generation, by and large, seems to behave however it sees fit. Alma barely managed to look at them with an expression of frightened shame. Child, Brother Theodoric said, 'tis not us thou needst must fear, though 'tis true that in insulting Brother Ortham in front of a whole assembly ye do indeed offer offense to all of us on the High Council. Brother Theodoric's gaze was unforgiving, but annoyed rather than enraged. He had hardly raised his voice. A theologian, Brother Theodoric was a legalist in his outlook. He served the order as its chief authority on the old scriptures. Thy problem now is going to be Brother Ortham. Our protocols and modes of address exist for good reasons. As a priestess, thou art charged to remind novices of this. So why are we having this discussion with thee? Where is thy obedience? Brother Theodoric paused. Silence does not suffice. Answer him, Friend Vilnia said sharply. The sins and failings of Friend Dierne and Friend Lizelle were as plainly visible to the High Council as they were to her. With such people in the order, if strict discipline were not maintained, such marginals would never be vetted, and all would be lost to corruption and apostasy. Alma agreed. Now her actions this morning were beginning to seem impetuous and prideful. I was spiritually proud. The presence of Father Karras was too overwhelming. I became fixated upon his achievements and did not see myself in proper relation to him, that is, to the order, the house that he has built, Alma said. Vilnia started to speak, stopped, and looked at Brother Theodoric. And from where comes this pride? It is because, like the rest of us, you are a believer? Or because thou hast attained a measure of advancement within a religious order? Were ye to stand before the master builder this very moment, and he asked, What hast thou built? How wouldst thou answer him? Theodoric was taking this in a philosophical direction, but Alma didn't dare relax. My vows were sincere. For the sake of my error today, I pray that the builder will test my resolve more severely than would otherwise have satisfied him. I impatiently await the chance to be compelled to act upon everything I swore, Alma said. Ha! I'd be cautious if I were thee, Theodoric laughed. When thou hast actually been compelled to act a few times whilst carrying the mantle of leadership, you'll learn not to hunger after trials and tribulations so greedily, eh? Brother Theodoric smiled at Friend Vilnia. Indeed, since thou wouldst not listen to Brother Ortham, listen to me, Hobart. Leadership is a heavy burden, a difficult responsibility, and it is not to be taken lightly. Vilnia was not yelling the way she often did. Alma had been expecting worse. Brother Ortham is going to take his sweet time in forgiving this. If thou hadst merely given him his due, he'd have ignored thee, woman as you are. Now thou art on his bad side. If thou were an important leader of this order, wouldst thou wish to be brazenly disregarded by a mere priestess, especially while you were ordaining her? Brother Theodoric continued. Nay, it was not that Alma disagreed with Brother Theodoric, but something about the way he'd said that. The emotion was hard to describe. Use thy womanly emotions to feel the way that Brother Ortham might, to be publicly disrespected. Theodoric was still pushing. I think that Friend Alma takes your point, Friend Vilnia spoke up. I will speak to Brother Artis and tell him that 'twould be unnecessary and unhelpful to bring this matter up with thee. Consider thyself reprimanded, friend. Now tell us about thy plans for the factory tonight. Brother Theodoric looked puzzled. The judge had not yet finished rendering his opinion, and the subject had already been changed. I shall oversee the factory. Seemingly from out of nowhere, Alma was now in trouble. Her fists were clenched. The muscles in her thighs and back were flexing spasmodically. Her throat closed. Her vision was beginning to tunnel. For a second, she wasn't even in her body. I, who as supervisor ought most to know that Brother Artist whilst be babysitting our highest achieving priest. It took Friend Dierne for me to hear of it. Alma realized that she was yelling at them. Trust me. Brother Artis will be keeping Fredus on a most short leash. We know very well what a problem he hath become, and we take it very seriously. Friend Vilnia had actually softened her tone. The heat was searing along the whole length of Alma's spine. Alma knew that her elders were not nearly as displeased by her behavior during her ordination ceremony as they were trying to seem, As her superiors, they were just trying to give her feedback. And even though Theodoric was rather crude about how he spoke to her, Alma did not feel that his intent was malicious. This had not been a pleasant conversation, but it otherwise would have been a minor misfire of a cylinder. So what was happening to her? A simple upbraiding seemed to have been the spark that had just ignited a tinderbox. Why hadn't she seen it coming? Alma realized it had been the door to the crypt. That's what this was all about. The rage brewing within her crossed the tipping point. All of a sudden, Brother Theodoric was looking nervous. "We shall huddle behind locked doors like frightened rabbits in the very house of the builder while evil moves unquiet against us." From her disassociated perspective, Alma watched calmly as the basal functions of her brain flew inevitably out of control. The situation would have to resolve itself. Through her mind, body, and spirit, the builder's wrath had been summoned. It was not for her to gainsay it. Alma stared down upon them. Vilnia was trying to regain her attention, but Alma couldn't care less what she had to say. "I tell thee plainly that not on my watch shalt the tragedy be repeated," she bore into their faces with her eyes. "I tell thee plainly that I will fight evil, and if any shall fall tonight, it shall be I." Brother Theodoric stood up out of his chair, his eyes wide. "Friend Hobart," Friend Vilnia said quietly, pointing at Alma's right hand. The gear had long since fully formed. Its density was exceeding that of most usual alloys, and it was spinning well in excess of 5,000 revolutions per minute. Vilnia had somehow soothed Alma back into control of herself, but then Alma did a really foolish thing. She pulled receptively on the energy flows, squeezing the subtle channels and clenched with her fist. She reabsorbed the gear, which was composed of the builder's magic. "This is going to cost me," Alma knew. Friend Vilnia's grimace was pained, but she almost burst out laughing. "Friend Hobart, I think thou wilt want some fresh air, and perhaps thou might consider speaking to friend Pendulous. I am sure he will want to congratulate you as well. We are fully confident that thou art competent to run tonight's shift in the factory, come what might, and you really must not neglect to get some rest before thy shift begins." Friend Vilnia actually smiled at her. She was trying to help Alma get out of there quickly. Alma nodded, turned away, and began a labored run down the hall. It had felt like molten lead going through the skin of her hand and coming to rest in her upper forearm. The pain would have driven the uninitiated insane, but Alma was trained to handle the sensations of metal in all its various states. Collecting and transmuting ambient matter and energy into metal by means of her energetic body was as natural to Alma as swinging a mace was to an acolyte at arms. The proper thing to have done would have been to aim the gear down the hall and send it, hoping that no one would walk into its path. Instead, she'd impulsively retracted the fully formed gear back into her energy. Until it left her hand, the gear only existed conditionally, residing in an indeterminate state that those without magical training would be unable to comprehend. That gear was going to come out, though. Alma could feel that the rapid decelerization and cooling had shattered it into dozens of fragments. Getting rid of it was going to be a lot less painful, but it was coming fast. Alma rounded the corner and leaned against the wall. Her arm felt like it weighed several tons. Friend Loris stood in the middle of the corridor. Noticing her, he leveled an assertive and steady gaze at her. "Get out of the way, you tank-brained bottlehead," she thought. "Hit the deck! Now!" she blared at him, aiming her right arm with her left hand, lifting it above his head. What? Friend Loris had no conception of the danger he was in. He was too surprised that she'd issued him an order. "Thou wilt fall to the ground. I bid thee do it. Now!" she screamed. Something approximating recognition passed over his face. Then his eyes went as wide as saucers, and dropping his mace, Loris fell to the ground and covered his head and neck with his hands. Ah! Alma wailed. The pain was intolerable as the ice-cold chunks of iron pressed against the ends of her pathways. She couldn't let go until it had all moved back into her left hand, or she'd have to do this more than once. At last she felt the final fragment sit itself upon the non-existent pile of slag in her hand. "Send!" she exhaled. The blast was accompanied by a sound so loud that it caused her hearing to fail. All that Alma heard was a ringing hum. Chunks of metal flew forth from her hand in a random, ever-expanding pattern. Thankfully, the pattern was still tight enough that it passed over Friend Loris, but the deadly storm impacted against the other end of the hall with such force that some of the chunks embedded themselves deeply into the metal plates. Other pieces ricocheted back at them, but not with enough energy to be dangerous. Instantly, Alma felt better, and there was surprisingly little residual soreness. The technique was designed to be used in battle, so it had to be somewhat foolproof. Alma righted herself, adjusted her robes, and walked over to Friend Loris. The fearless defender peered up at her without moving. "Get up." It was, she thought, a rather stern tone to use, considering that she had almost killed him. Friend Loris scrambled to his feet and took several steps backwards. He placed one hand respectfully on his helmet and gave her a shallow bow. "Don't grovel," she admonished him. Friend Loris stood straight up at attention. She pointed at his mace. "Pick it up." Loris grabbed the mace but kept the head pointedly on the ground. "Now let me out." Loris rushed to open the door, and as though he were locked inside with a hideous monster at that, he threw it open and dashed out of her way. Behind her, Alma could hear him frantically re-locking the door once she had passed through. Not good. At all. Alma was never this far out of calibration. In truth, the builder's magic absolutely did involve a judicious use of affect, but with control. The performance she'd just put on was a perfect aberration. The explanation was simple. She was still hurting over what had happened to her comrades. Badly. She'd told herself she'd made peace with it, and that had been a lie. Fortunately, everybody understood. When she'd started yelling about preventing a repeat incident, Brother Theodoric had made no attempt to shout her down. He'd let her have out with it. She would need to come to terms with it, though, and soon. But she didn't know how. And that stung all the more because Alma's life centered on accomplishing whatever needed doing. Comatose sleep, perhaps after food, seemed like the best course of action. But fresh air was a far more practical solution. Besides, Friend Vilnia's suggestion to go see Friend Pendulous was a good one. Alma exited the Acolyte's quarters through the back door and walked along the stainless steel sidewalk, across the barren courtyard and towards the cemetery. Sure enough, there was Friend Pendulous. He was a Methuselah. He'd been an old man when she was born 40 years ago. He claimed that he'd never known his exact birth date, and there were no records. He also claimed to have been a young acolyte when the disaster struck the old quarter. Part of his charm consisted in heroic tales about the downfall of the old Hammerite cathedral. Alma withheld judgment. It was an outrageous claim. The fires had been a long time ago, and for Pendulous to already have been an elevated acolyte at the time would mean that he was now well in excess of 100 years. Friend Pendulous made some people nervous, including the doctors who had recently examined him. They conclusively determined that he was indeed unnaturally old. But all of this was suppressed by the fact that Father Karras clearly believed that Friend Pendulous was telling the truth. Karras regularly invited Friend Pendulous to dine, and Pendulous would entertain him with stories of the olden days. Friend Pendulous had been a Hammerite, but he was not referred to as brother. He held no leadership position, and aside from Father Karras, the High Council members avoided him like the plague. For that, there was no explanation, and it only added to his aura of mystery. Among the younger members of the order, he was seen as a father confessor, a veteran of the rank and file, wise and authorized, but casual and approachable. Alma took him seriously, though she thought that he was often presented as something of a gimmick. Despite a vague uncertainty, Alma had a good rapport with him and had benefited several times from his advice. "Let us have a seat together, sister." Friend Pendulous had been hovering near the tombstones, talking to the spirits of his departed brothers. But while she'd been gathering wool, he'd noticed her and was now gesturing to the bench. Alma had to look down to see him. She was taller than half the men in the order. Pendulous had clearly never been tall, and now he was almost a hunchback. His skin was tan leather. Several wisps of lifeless white hair stuck out aimlessly from the sides of his otherwise bald head. His brown eyes were narrow and sunken. He had once been stocky, but now he was almost as misshapen as the warped cane he used to steady himself. And yet, there was something kind about him that filtered through all the oddness. "Thank you, friend. Let us," Alma said. They sat down next to each other on the stone slab that sufficed for a bench. "Thy ordination speaketh to thy quality, sister. The order is blessed and well served to have thee as a leader." Pendulous did not sound insincere, but he seemed to be talking to fill the silence. His mind was focusing on something else. "Thank you for saying so," she replied. "The foundation which we are now pouring will fully harden and settle once all of us old men are gathered unto the builder. Until then, we carry the taint of our prior errors with us into the new works," Pendulous said. Alma had not been expecting that. "But aren't you also speaking of our Lord Karis when you say that?" Alma asked. "No." Pendulous shook his head with the force of an immovable fact. "Our Lord Karis stands apart. He cannot be held to the same standards by which the rest of us measure ourselves." Alma could only agree. "I knowest well that thou art constantly being reminded of the importance of thy responsibilities. Thou art a priestess now. You must understand the importance of what hath been placed into thy hands. I never had any aspiration to the office of the priesthood. My task was always and only the forge. For a forger, any mistake mayest be mastered with diligence and courage. Sloth and cowardice are the enemies of a forger. The height of elevated ordination contains the danger of a fall. In this it resembles pride." Pendulous was lecturing at her, and he also seemed genuinely unhappy. "Therefore, I pray constantly for humility and patience so that I may learn best how to lead well," Alma said, trying to sound non-defensive. "I do think, though, that perhaps I am misunderstood. I shall take heed of these warnings I am constantly being given about pride, but I can't not agree that I am so prideful as it seems I am perceived to be. I hath just today become a priestess. Hath enough time passed to judge my attitude?" And it was true. Apparently she had offended no fewer than 4 of her elders today with her sinful pride. Pendulous was looking straight at her. It made Alma uncomfortable. "Did Brother Theodoric or Friend Vilnia ask thee to speak to me of these things?" Alma challenged him, her gaze hardening. "No. Nor was I at thy side when Lord Karis put thee on notice about the role thou art to have in bringing about paradise." Pendulous met her gaze with unexpected energy and strength. "Perhaps you spoke privately with him and he told you, though I doubt that this is the type of conversation he'd want you to have with me. Thou must also know that he told me to allow myself the smallest iota of satisfaction. I cannot equate that with an excess of pride." Alma was frustrated, and she was letting it get the better of her. She had no idea whether or not Father Karras had spoken to Pendulous about her, or what might have been said. All of this vague gloom and doom coming at her from above was becoming tiresome. She took some comfort from the fact that Father Karras himself seemed to feel that she was doing well. She wondered if all these venerable old fossils were going to make it difficult for her to see him. "I know what Lord Karras hath said to thee." Pendalus's tone was now utterly dejected. "Thou art right. Your hoary forebears are in no position to lecture thee on the subject of pride. I am sorry, sister. In truth I am. Look at me. I am at the end of this life's path. I shall not live to see the completion of the builder's plan. But you had yet many good years left to thee. Since the olden times, this was how one generation reared the next. It was the builder's will." Pendulus leaned forward on his cane and rose to his feet. He took several steps towards the gravestones. Alma haltingly tried to re-engage him. "When the builder's paradise arrives, we shall all be reunited. The world will be made into a worthy addition to his house, and we will all live with him in joy and harmony forever." The old man's demeanor was now so sunken that Alma's lesson in Scripture had sounded like pleading even to her. "Mayhap." Pendulus didn't even look up from the gravestones. Aha. Alma was naturally perceptive, but she'd also had extensive training in how to determine the state of a person's spiritual health. This poor old man had outlived his faith. The lifestyle and memories remained precious. But at over 100 years of age, Friend Pendulus was now a confirmed unbeliever. He had long ceased even to smile when the scriptures were read. The idea of spiritual truth was annoying to him. He'd been living in the trenches of life for too long. It was a known problem among aged clergy. "Just what exactly did you mean, friend, when you said I had many good years left in the past tense?" Alma asked. She was going to tell him to face her, but he'd been expecting the question and answered instantly. "The mind of Lord Karras is beyond any of us. None of us fathom it fully, and only he doth see the grand design in all its entirety. It will yet take much effort to bring about the builder's paradise. It will require the faithful to make monumental sacrifices. It will demand the purging of whole breeds and nations. We cannot complete the great work ourselves. We are incapable. The final act shall fall upon the shoulders of the builder's children. However, Lord Karras may refine it later. The first comes the broad strokes. The chiseling will be relentless and almighty. And if the builder decides that thou shouldst live to see it, sister, thou wilt not recognize the world remade." Alma was stunned. Friend Pendulus didn't turn around. "But thou hast a more immediate problem on thy hands," Friend Pendulus said in a neutral tone as he started to walk away. "And that is?" Alma called after him. Friend Pendulus pointed at one of the gravestones with his cane. Looking at it, she felt the quickening instantly. Alma was an adept, but having lived for so long, the old man was more attuned than she was. A noxious breeze swept through the cemetery ever so slightly. The sun seemed to burn anything its rays touched. Flies buzzed around the carcass of the tree. The stones of the entire seminary seemed to be stiff and wanted to flex and stretch. Looking at the tombstone Friend Pendulus had pointed to, Alma heard, ever so faintly, the unmistakable scream at the edges of her perception. They were coming. Tonight they would come. Shit. Alma stood up and hurried back inside.